describe it are probably eco-anxiety or climate grief. But our responses to these difficult topics really involve a very wide spectrum of emotions. So it can present as guilt, anger, grief, hope, numbness, love, trauma, despair. There's been just an absolute explosion of terms and research on the emotional dimension over the past 4 or 5 years. I thought it was really notable that eco-anxiety was the runner-up for Oxford's Word of the Year in 2019. And last year, Google searches for the term climate anxiety were up 565%, I think showing how prominent this issue has become. The American Psychological Association started to pay attention a few years back in a major report where they identified eco-anxiety as chronic fear of environmental doom. You also hear terms like pre-traumatic stress, global dread. I always cite the definition from science writer Britt Ray, who wrote, quote, "At its simplest," I have it up here, "at this late stage in the climate crisis, eco-anxiety is merely a sign of attachment to the world." I myself became interested in this topic partly because of my direct experience of the endless wildfires in California, which is where I grew up, and I still spend a lot of time with family who have been directly impacted and had to flee fires multiple times. But even before that, I was really struggling with climate despair just in response to the day-to-day stuff. The latest IPCC report would come out, or I'd see a headline about an ice sheet falling into the ocean, or the latest scientific study predicting that 50% of all species are at risk of extinction. And whatever that trigger was would plunge me into a really dark place where it felt like nothing I was doing really mattered because the problem was so big. Feeling like every time we take a step forward on climate policy, we get knocked back half a mile by some oil company or a politician like Joe Manchin. Feeling like the house was on fire and every alarm should be going off, but instead my own friends were sitting around ignoring the smoke. And when they did acknowledge it, it seemed like they didn't want to use the fire hose to put it out because that would get their furniture wet. So I would have these thoughts and go through these real cycles of depression and burnout, or maybe drift into apathy and withdrawal. And I share this not because my personal experience is really that important or even unique, but actually for the opposite reason, because it's not unique. So many people feel this way, but talking about dark emotional dimensions is not something that we commonly do in climate discussions. And there are a lot of reasons for that. In my own case, and I know this is true for many educators and activists, we often feel that we have to always project optimism and hope, or the people around us will lose heart. But I think the bigger reason that our society has consistently refused to face the psychological elements of climate breakdown is that we've primarily treated the climate story as a science story. For the past 30 years, scientists have been the main communicators. So we've talked about planetary destruction using statistics and graphs and numerical equations. And this is not at all to disparage the scientists. I mean, they're just doing what scientists do. That is the nature of the discipline. But there are other ways to tell this story, especially when in the midst of all of these external changes, many of us are carrying a deep, often unconscious grief, because on some level we know that our world is dying and systems are unraveling and there is more loss to come. And I think in a society of collective denial and organized mass distraction like ours, that pain has become a shadow for many of us that follows us around, making us more and more desperate to avoid what we know is true. So even really for non-scientists, that scientific framing, which uses the rhetoric of numbers and data to represent loss, is very alluring, because it excludes those frightening subjective elements. It's not necessarily in the in the nature of scientific rhetoric to wander into the murky terrain of existential or philosophical questions. And we can just imagine how different it would be if we had put philosophers and artists in charge of communicating about climate from the beginning. So climate activist Margaret Klein Solomon talks about this compartmentalization in her book. I don't know if some of you know it. It's Facing the Climate Truth. And she talks about how for many years she relegated climate to what she calls the science part of her brain because it just felt less painful. Until just discovering that strategy simply doesn't work, right? We could just as well say that cancer is an issue for science to solve. But anybody facing a diagnosis or who loves somebody is ill knows that, understanding the fear and the grief and the anticipatory loss and facing that is just an essential part of the experience. And we can't tell a person with cancer, well, this is just something for the scientists to sort out. But even if it did work to push that heartbreak out of the conversation, one of the main arguments I want to make today is that there's something essential that's lost in doing so. So that's really actually going to be the second half of my talk. Before I get to that second half on grief and hope, I want to spend just a couple of minutes outlining what some of the mental health impacts of climate change are. That version that I just described, where a sense of loss follows you around like a shadow, probably best falls under this concept of solastalgia, which I'm sure many of you have heard by now. This comes from philosopher Glenn Albrecht, who coined the term, and he's playing on the language of nostalgia, longing for a time or a place that you can't go back to. But solastalgia happens when home itself becomes unfamiliar. It's not that you've left the place, it's almost as if place has left you. So, we could probably spin 1,000 examples right here sitting in this room of, bees and songbirds that you no longer see, or not being able to spend the days outside during the summer because of the smoke and heat, fewer bugs on your windshield than you remember as a kid. Then there are the much more acute forms of climate distress. So this is the second bullet. And what originally motivated me to learn about this topic, in addition to my personal experience, was seeing the impact on my students. And I met with some of the students here this morning and asked them for their own responses. And I shared some of these responses from the first day of one of my classes at the University of Washington. This was just 3 weeks ago. And I asked students how they felt about the future. And you can see the responses here. I feel hopeless, useless, and minuscule. Why even bother bringing children into an already dying world? A whirlwind of despair, overwhelmed by anxiety and grief. Seeing the planet break down has made me break down, and on and on. And the data show that this is a global phenomenon. It's not just tree huggers in Tacoma and Seattle. Just last fall, the largest research study ever done on mental health impacts of climate change for young people showed that it is causing profound psychological distress. So this was just published in The Lancet after a team surveyed 10,000 teens from across the world: Nigeria, Finland, Australia, India, Brazil, the US, the Philippines. 56% of youth believe that humanity is doomed. 45% say that climate anxiety disrupts daily activities like sleeping or focusing on their schoolwork. 1 in 4 are afraid to have children, and 77 characterized our climate future as frightening. I thought it was really, really powerful that the authors referred to this distress as a form of moral injury. So this emotional harm is a matter of intergenerational inequality. It's also a matter of racial and economic inequality. So in those responses published in the study, concern about climate change was concentrated much more heavily in poorer countries and communities of color, the very people who have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, which are wrecking the planet. And they're the ones that are suffering the highest emotional toll because they are experiencing the heaviest climate impacts. So for example, you'll see in the Philippines, 92% of youth surveyed said the future was frightening, compared to 68% here in the United States. And in that statement from one of the respondents, Mitzi Tan, who's a 23-year-old from the Philippines, she talks about how she grew up afraid of drowning in her own bedroom. So this really aligns with the third category of increasing numbers of people who've experienced trauma from extreme climate-related events. There's a huge body of mental health research, including a major report from the APA linking extreme weather distress or extreme weather disasters to negative mental health consequences, chronic anxiety and depression, traumatic grief, post-traumatic stress, sleep disorders, and substance abuse. And these effects have been shown to develop in anywhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of people impacted, which is not surprising when you think about it, right? People lose loved ones in hurricanes and homes and livelihoods and communities. And once again, we're overwhelmingly talking about marginalized communities and communities of color who lack the resources to escape and survive and recover, which makes this more alarming when we look at the projections from researchers that extreme weather events will double in coming decades. So in just one example, climate scientists found that since the 1970s, the number of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes have increased by 20 to 35% around the world. There are already twice as many hurricanes in the Atlantic on average compared with a century ago. And as you probably know, this is linked to warmer sea surface temperatures and the fact that warmer air holds more moisture, so that gives more fuel to hurricanes. And then also greater flooding damage from bigger storm surges, which will further exacerbate or be further exacerbated by sea level rise. Climate change is disrupting people's identity as well, their livelihood, their subsistence, especially people whose ways of life are closely tied to the land. And I thought it was really powerful that one of the students introduced this talked about the relation between salmon and indigenous communities in our area. So that's one example where, the warming climate is really wiping out these cultural practices. Again, whether it's in our region, that decline of salmon, or we go to Arctic regions where people can't even travel to ancestral sites or hunt in the old ways because the landscape is melting beneath them. So I think when we talk about climate change as an existential threat, this is really a quintessential example, because it's not just a threat to life and survival, but also to people's culture, their relation to the past, and their entire way of being in the world. And so for that reason, the current experience of climate injustice is magnifying past and ongoing traumas for colonized people. Nyla Burton has a powerful article on this, and I put the title up on this slide because I think it's a really important one if you do any follow-up reading after today. And I also included the link to it on the resources page for my website. Okay, so two more here. Another area of research that's rapidly growing has linked hotter temperatures to increased aggression. So on hot days, for example, there are more fights at ballparks and more people honking their horns. There are higher incidents of domestic abuse and violent crime. Researchers have tested this correlation in multiple ways with the links repeatedly confirmed. So it's not just a spike in violent incidents during a heat wave as compared to cooler days, but hotter cities in the U.S. already have significantly higher rates of violence than cooler cities, even when variables like unemployment, age distribution, poverty, and other risk factors are controlled for. And this may just be a case of science catching up with common folk wisdom. I have a quote here from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet where this is commented on. So then the final area I'll mention where we see the mental health toll of climate change is with suicide. And there are examples here ranging from despairing activists to suicide among the indigenous communities I mentioned, whose ways of life are being so radically altered. We're seeing this from impoverished regions in India with farmers taking their lives in the face of debt from failed crops, all the way to more affluent places like Australia, which had a significant spike in suicide during the millennial drought, where farmers watched their livestock die and their land dry up and blow away. And a few years back, you might also remember the Virgin Islands were hit twice with devastating hurricanes in a single season. And the governor there declared a mental health state of emergency when attempted suicide became a kind of secondary disaster. And studies showed that 40% of children had post-traumatic symptoms. So all of this is just a brief and very partial, although very heavy overview of how this is playing out. But I want to argue that there is more to the story here. Climate doesn't just impact mental health. The reverse is also true. Our ability to cultivate emotional resilience will certainly determine how well we respond to this crisis. And I think this is really where our agency lies. So the story isn't all bad news. I want to acknowledge that, of course, some people have strong misgivings about this focus on developing internal resources and resilience, because there's a tendency to assume that it's inward looking and that it directs our attention away from structural injustice and institutions that need to be transformed. So white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, racism, the fossil fuel empire, and its entire history of obstructing attempts to transition to a regenerative economy. I myself have really felt those misgivings for a long time, like it would in some way be apolitical to focus on my personal well-being, until really learning from people around me who'd been engaged in this work for a lot longer than me, that these approaches are not mutually exclusive, and this should not be framed as a binary choice. In fact, inner resilience is precisely what equips us to do the work of addressing the structural conditions that are driving climate upheavals in the first place. So we have this reciprocal dynamic where climate impacts mental health impacts climate. So with all of that said, that brings me really to the main point of my talk today, which is to share some thoughts about how we might start the process of building that existential capacity by reimagining our relationship with climate grief and anxiety. And then second, how we might reconsider some conventional assumptions about hope as we think about our future and the work ahead. So I'm going to dive into that first piece by reading a 3-minute excerpt from the podcast that the team here mentioned. It's called Facing It. And this is a series where I explore how dark emotions like grief might actually be a doorway to something powerful that we've forgotten in this whole conversation about climate change. So in this particular excerpt I'm going to share, I'm reflecting on that course that I designed at the University of Washington to help students cope with climate grief. And what I found when I walked through the door the first day was a room full of students who saw grief as a problem to be solved. And they wanted me to help them make it go away. And that really enabled me to recognize a misunderstanding that I had also been carrying around. Okay. This is some artwork by one of my students to start with. When I first launched my seminar on eco-grief, I was every bit as distressed as my students and looking for a way to extinguish my pain for all this suffering. But something unexpected happened along the way. I had always thought of grief as a bad thing, a dark state to avoid or overcome as quickly as possible. I thought that feeling grief was like succumbing to a preventable illness, or that once it took hold, I might fall into a bottomless hole of despair. But in time, it dawned on us that maybe we were seeking solutions to the wrong problem. We all wanted to fix the way we felt so we could go back to feeling happy. But grief isn't something to be fixed because it's not dysfunctional. In fact, it's a healthy and necessary process we have to undergo in order to heal. First, grief isn't one of many options for accepting loss. Grief is the process of accepting loss. I get why many people working towards sustainability want to sidestep emotional issues and push the public straight into action. The situation is urgent, and dwelling on our feelings can seem like an extravagance as the fires close in. But the problem is when we try to jump straight to the final step without first processing the emotional toll of all this lost beauty in life, we're bypassing the very insights that motivate us to fight for our world in the first place. Ignoring ecological grief is like trying to rush through any great loss, a job, a home, someone you love, without pausing to acknowledge what you're leaving behind. And in all those cases, we're not just losing something we once had, we're also losing the future that many of us had counted on. Denial isn't just a description for people who reject the science. It describes university professors like me and scientists studying climate change and activists fighting to keep things from getting worse. We understand the problem intellectually, but we don't live as though we do. We accept the facts, but we haven't felt our way through what those facts mean, how our lives, how all lives will be undone in some way. We're like the person who knows a loved one is dead, but hasn't let that reality penetrate to their core, where it will reorganize all the ways they relate to the past and future and determine all they'll have to let go of. We can't act creatively and honestly in this new reality until we mourn the passing of the old one. And all the ancient wisdom traditions affirm this truth, that grief is not here to take us hostage. It is the agent necessary, or the agent needed to transform us so that we can confront a similarly transformed world. But then as the podcast series progresses, I'm trying to also push beyond just reframing grief as something that's not bad, to also consider ways that it's actively good. Grief arises from love and deep attachment, as our presenters pointed out in that quote. You will not grieve for something that you don't love. It's a way of honoring our connection and our empathy with other species or people. When we feel that pain, we remember that our existence and our well-being are deeply intertwined with other lives. And I didn't personally watch it, but like everybody was quoting that line from a recent superhero miniseries where a character says, "What is grief if not love persevering?" I think it came from like Marvel Comics, but you know, it's great. I'm so drawn to this quote by Malkia Devich-Cyril, where she wrote, "Joy is not the opposite of grief. Grief is the opposite of indifference. Grief is an evolutionary indicator of love, the kind of great love that guides revolutionaries." I think recognizing this is essential for my students and other climate activists who've internalized the assumption that grief leads to inaction. Right? We live in a very grief-phobic culture where the moment you even say that word, the image that comes to mind is someone who, you know, can't get out of bed because they're so immobilized by pain. Someone who is depleted rather than being charged and driven by passion out in their communities creating change. And that misleading assumption is exacerbated by this pervasive message to avoid negative feelings and get over it in our culture when we feel distress. Messages that we shouldn't dwell in our pain, right? Dwelling is a bad thing. So we're told to move on, and as if grief and movement were somehow mutually exclusive. The truth is, when we see grief as an outgrowth of love, it may very well be that these are the emotions that will save us, if anything saves us now. And that's because there is no limit to the lengths that we will go to protect what we love. As so many social justice movements show us, love is more powerful than fear, anger, even hope, and all of the other emotions. And I think because as Devich-Cyril's reflections suggest, it doesn't just rouse us to action, but it sustains us in that engagement over the long haul. And I talked about this morning with the students I met with, and they were very perceptive on this, I think, that fear might be really good at mobilizing action at the outset, but we need to remember we're going to be doing this work for the rest of our lives. And fear and anger lead to burnout. So we have to ask ourselves if that's a sustainable strategy over the long haul. And then a final point I'll make in my comments on grief and love is that one of the reasons it's hard for us to see the value in dark emotions is because of our binary mindset that splits emotional responses into two mutually exclusive camps, especially when we talk about hope versus despair. I think that binary thinking has probably contributed significantly to the rise of climate doomism in recent years. I'm sure you're all familiar with this label of a climate doomer, someone who says it's too late, that we're already screwed. A lot of climate scientists and activists are now arguing that our culture, at least here in the US, jumped from denial to doom almost overnight. And that's become the new big obstacle to motivating people. So on her podcast, climate scientist Jacqueline Gill said that just a decade ago, it felt like very few people were paying attention, and all of her energy was going towards convincing the public that climate change was real. And then suddenly things reversed, and the public interest and media coverage absolutely surged, but now the focus was on these very apocalyptic outcomes. And so her quote here expresses that frustration with replacing one impediment with another. And similarly, Michael Mann is probably the best known climate scientist in the US. He's the guy who created the famous hockey stick graph of carbon emissions. He spent well over a decade in these legendary Twitter battles and media debates tirelessly debunking climate deniers. But in his new book, he says he's now redirecting all of that energy to rushing around debunking the climate doomers who say it's too late to save ourselves. And so he calls this the new climate war. And when I first heard researchers talking about this reversal, I didn't really know if I believed it. I mean, it just seemed like provocative material for a really catchy headline. But then I heard psychologists like Leslie Davenport explain both of these positions as a basic psychic defense against the human discomfort with uncertainty and ambiguity. So we don't like to be in an in-between state where you're unsure what's going to happen. And so while that sometimes leads to disavowal and turning away, other people go towards doom, right? It's too late, can't do anything. And Davenport says that paradoxically, moving to either one of these places provides a kind of psychological relief because it gets us out of that gray zone where we're staring into the void and having to sit with that uncertainty and ambivalence. So to bring this back to my point about grief, I think doomers do acknowledge and embrace grief, but they misunderstand it as an excuse for inaction. They see grief as an endpoint rather than a doorway, as Margaret Klein Solomon so beautifully put it. Then hope is the final emotion I want to address before getting to some steps to help us all navigate this difficult material. And this is probably the one that I think gets the most airtime in climate communication. I mean, we're just obsessed with hope in climate work. You often hear the message that no matter how bad things get, we must never lose hope. And from my own experience, it is by far the single most common and most predictable question I get at the end of my talks is, what gives you hope? It's also a deeply polarizing concept that also falls into that binary mindset that I mentioned, where it's either promoted as a kind of panacea or it's dismissed as the trope of fools who don't get how bad things really are. I personally think that it's more useful to think of this in terms of the difference between passive hope and active hope. That first version is essentially a kind of wish for a happy ending, something that keeps you possibly on the sidelines by deferring action onto the future or onto other people. And I think that's why people rightfully dismiss that kind of hope as very counterproductive. Another pitfall of this passive version of hope is that it's based on expectation of a particular outcome. And that is problematic in a reality where setbacks are inevitable and the outcome is very, very uncertain. If we need reassurance of the probability of winning before we act, we will quickly fall into disillusionment because the odds are very challenging. But if we think of Václav Havel's famous definition of hope, the question of probability is really irrelevant. As he wrote after his long experience as a political prisoner, quote, "Hope is not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. So the trick is to find motivation in our values, in a sense of justice, because unlike outcomes, those can never be taken away from us. So even when things seem hopeless, our sense of purpose keeps us going. So I really prefer to use that language of purpose or meaning instead of hope. Or other people use that term that I mentioned, active hope or radical hope. Diego Arguedas Ortiz is a Costa Rican climate writer who talks about this in a piece that he wrote, where he writes, real, good, useful hope has nothing to do with positive news. Instead, it is profoundly linked with action, both ours and others alongside us. There's only one way to earn hope, and that's rolling up our sleeves. And I think that's a really powerful way to frame hope as something that we earn or something we do rather than something that we just get to have. But I also think if we're being honest, we need to recognize that hope is not the end game. Getting people to take collective action is the point, not just making ourselves feel hopeful. So while there are multiple steps in managing climate anxiety and distress that I'm about to list off, and my podcast walks listeners through all of those steps as well if you want more context, I just want to reiterate that getting actively engaged in climate solutions, which is number 5 here, is really at the heart of this entire list of recommendations. So here's the checklist. Number 1, the most powerful place to start is simply acknowledging and making space to talk about our emotional responses to climate upheaval. And this is one that I think sounds almost too simplistic to really be valuable, but it's much more profound than it appears at first glance. And that's because a huge part of our depression and anxiety comes from feeling alone or isolated. You know, we've all had that moment of wondering, am I the only one who feels this way? The research shows that when you feel isolated, you aren't empowered to take action. But openly acknowledging and talking about those emotional responses really helps create a sense of community and solidarity, which itself counteracts the perception of isolation. The other reason that acknowledgement is so crucial is simply because our culture doesn't really have established norms for recognizing and mourning the loss of nature. And that's a problem insofar as mourning is a social process. We all understand this in the case of familiar cultural norms around the death of a person. There is a reason that across cultures and throughout the ages, people who lose a loved one turn to social rituals like funerals and vigils and memorials, even those seemingly trivial practices like sending sympathy cards or flowers. People can join support groups, they can get help from books or therapists that specialize in bereavement. And it's the social nature of those rituals that helps validate our pain and that removes our isolation from others, which again is in itself healing. But let's say that you feel grief for the disappearance of snow on the mountains behind your town, or the death of millions of animals in a wildfire. There really aren't any established social structures to acknowledge it. And so this is what's known as disenfranchised grief, a kind of pain that is essentially made invisible, and that, again, just further deepens the harm that's experienced. So that's our starting point, just naming and collectively acknowledging all of these forms of loss, whether human or non-human. Then number 2, how can we reframe anxiety and grief as tools that can actually empower climate solutions? So I already covered some of this in highlighting how grief can intensify love. But one thing I want to add here is that any framing that suggests that climate anxiety or depression is a mental illness is really dangerous because it locates the problem in the individual instead of the social structure. So beware of that. Rather than thinking of eco-anxiety as a dysfunction, I encourage my own students to see it in a completely reversed perspective as a moral emotion, a response arising from an accurate assessment of the situation and a sense of compassion and desire for justice. And I am by no means the first person to say something along these lines. In the quote here from Jiddu Krishnamurti, he writes, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." And then Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, "The salvation of the world lies in the hands of the maladjusted." So these insights apply to other forms of environmental maladjustment as well, whether we're rejecting racism or violence or inequality. And I think this is something that you can do for others as well as yourself. When someone expresses these dark emotions, see if you can help them recognize them as signs of emotional health and compassion, right? How our anger and outrage arise from a sense of injustice. When a person shares something they fear about the future, that can reveal trust and courage to speak openly. Or we might acknowledge how shame and awareness of complicity can ultimately open the way towards dismantling systems of oppression if it's channeled into collective political action. Uncertainty, I haven't listed that one up here, but uncertainty can be reframed as opportunity for creative potential and so on. Then number 3, we live our lives by stories. It's how we make sense of the world, how we understand ourselves and others, how we envision the future. So be aware of the kinds of narratives you're consuming and reproducing yourself. Most information we get about where the planet is headed comes from the media, and research shows that 85% of environmental news is told in the negative frame. And it's actually designed that way. The news is a profit-driven enterprise that cannot survive if it doesn't draw our eyeballs to the screen. So sensational stories of hurricanes and fires and destruction are going to get more play than subtle or nuanced stories of community change and long-term behind-the-scenes work of generating solutions. We also have to be aware that the addictive nature of catastrophic news is deliberately engineered to keep us coming back for more. And there are brain scans that show how we get a dopamine hit every time we check back and again and again to stay current on the latest update. But that long-term effect really is a perception that we are living in an apocalypse. And we can all think about the times that we've been sucked into doom scrolling loops where, like the first couple of months of the pandemic or the recent presidential elections or any other time where you cannot step away from the news cycle. And the moment you do, there's a kind of a physical reaction where you actually feel vulnerable or like you're compromising your own survival because we're so hardwired to think that knowing what's going on means that we're safe. That fixation with catastrophic stories and images is absolutely exacerbated by media companies. But at another level, it's also a function of our own psychological makeup. So this is known in psychology as the negativity bias, where even if we're presented with an equal amount of good and bad information, our minds are hardwired to pay more attention to the bad stuff. And there's an evolutionary function to that, because in a world of saber-toothed tigers and poisonous snakes, it's advantageous to have brains that are hyper-aware of anything that can pose a threat. But in today's world, where these images are broadcast around the clock to show us every bad thing that's happening everywhere in the world on screens that are in front of us, 24/7, I've got my phone right here, it's next to your cereal bowl, it's on your pillow at night. Our nervous system is not equipped to tolerate that endless chronic stress, and it can have physiological impacts that are really detrimental to mental health over time. So I'm not saying that we should sugarcoat the reality or stick our heads in the sand to avoid bad news, but being consciously aware that the media is deliberately appealing to that negativity bias is a very crucial first step to building resilience, because it reminds us that those catastrophic stories are just one version of reality. There's a whole universe of empowering stories that are happening at the same time as all the bad stuff. Every person who's engaged in creating change in every part of the world in countless ways. We see incredible shifts underway in financial markets, in technology, in our schools, social justice movements, energy, agriculture, conservation, youth movements. These solutions-based stories are vastly underreported, but they are every bit as real. Again, remember, 85% of environmental stories are the negative ones. This here is an example of what you'll see if you make the effort to look beyond the mainstream trends. And this is important. I want you all to know that these headlines are not something that I dug out from the archives. They are not from an entire last year or 6 months or even 1 month. This is a small sample from a 10-day period that I browsed when I sat down for about 15 minutes last week preparing this talk. And I just stopped taking screenshots when the slide was full. So again, this is from a 10-day window, and it's just a little sliver from that period. And I intentionally put in the minimum effort here and grab stuff at random to show that we don't really have to dig all that hard. The real challenge is shutting off that negativity bias that keeps us from seeing this in the first place. And if you like easy shortcuts, there are groups that aggregate this kind of stuff for you. I really like Grist's The Beacon. It's up in the top left. It's a newsletter that will send you a daily dose of good climate news. And they do have the bad stuff in there as well, but they put it farther down in the email. Project Drawdown is fantastic. A lot of you know about it. It researches and outlines the top evidence-based proposals for climate solutions. The Solutions Journalism Network is a consortium that reports on solutions to problems across the spectrum. And I want to emphasize that their goal is not to avoid the bad news. I mean, they still tell that part, but they add in the piece that is missing from the mainstream accounts, which is how are people responding? So the point of their of this entire organization is not necessarily just to make us feel good. They want to provide a template for interventions that have worked in one context so that we can apply them in others. And a lot of these up here are crowdsourced, so that's really cool. And I got a lot of this from Ellen Kelsey, who makes a powerful case that these deliberate efforts to seek positive stories empowers people. It will draw you closer to what inspires you to get engaged rather than making you want to hide in the basement. So it's not just about protecting our mental health. It's actually necessary for saving the planet. And that's because the psychology of despair and fear is a psychology of defeat that leads people to give up, to shut down, or retreat into denial. So her book walks readers through tons of research on this. And then lastly, I'm still actually on step number 3, but stories. I come from a humanities background, so this is like my turf. Stories have implications for the kinds of future that we're going to create. This is the idea behind the famous Jameson quote, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The perceived inevitability of our political and economic institutions thrives in a system that doesn't give us alternative stories or images. And I don't have to tell you that the genre of apocalypse absolutely dominates our discourse about the future. It's the genre of mainstream news, of climate fiction, of Hollywood film. In a recent article, I made the obvious and completely unoriginal argument that we can't create the future we desire if we can't imagine what it would look like. And this image, by the way, is a work of concept art based off of the novel The Fifth Sacred Thing by Starhawk. It's one of, unfortunately, too few works of ecotopian fiction, but definitely worth a read. The story is set in the mid-21st century where an ecotopian San Francisco defends itself from invaders using nonviolence and magic. I also love Joanna Macy's framework, where she breaks down the 3 dominant stories currently competing to define this moment. The first is the business as usual story, which wants to preserve the status quo and argues that economic growth and technological innovation and free market solutions will lead to prosperity for all if we just let them run their course. The second is the story of the Great Unraveling, which predicts irreversible social and ecological collapse, mass extinction, rising conflict over vanishing resources. This is obviously the dominant narrative of the climate movement, and one that most of my students subscribe to when they show up at the first day. And then the third story is what Macy calls the Great Turning, which sees in our current moment the possibility of profound social transformation towards genuine sustainability and environmental justice. And Macy says the point is not to argue over which of these three stories is correct, since they are all happening. Rather, the question is, which one do we invest in? And she writes that that third story, the Great Turning, the story of healing and recovery, is where you will go when you acknowledge that the first story is leading us to catastrophe, but you refuse to let the second story have the last word. So now I just spent 6 minutes saying something that civil rights activist and filmmaker Valerie Kaur said in one sentence when she asked, what if the darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but a darkness of the womb? So which story are we going to live in? Is this moment a womb or a tomb? Okay, two more, a little faster with the last two. Number 4 is to connect. As I've already noted, acknowledging and talking openly about eco-grief is a way of connecting and building community, so it's really important to seek out others who share your concern. The other point that I'll make here is that oftentimes the source of our despair isn't the crisis itself, so much as a longing for fellowship or the absence of a sense of purpose in the midst of difficulty. Rebecca Solnit's book here is really the best account I know in making that point. It's just packed with meticulously researched examples of how throughout history, when you look at periods of crisis like wars or natural disasters, people's spiritual lives and deep sense of meaning are not inhibited because of those events. In fact, the opposite is often true. A sense of purpose and fellowship that we crave can be deepened through adversity. And you hear this from many people who are engaged in social justice movements, that there's great joy and often a sense of adventure in knowing that they're part of a historic movement that's rising up to confront the greatest challenges and injustices of our time. And if you don't know where to find that connection, I've listed on the resources page of my website, which you can visit, a number of groups that meet virtually as well as in person to have these discussions and build community around eco-anxiety or eco-trauma. You can either take part in their meetings, or they will give you the templates and instructions to facilitate your own. The Climate Courage workshops are really great. I love them because they're so international. So it's a chance to log in and meet people from all over the world and from Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere talking about this. The Good Grief Network is also fantastic. It's really one of the things that got me into this work in the first place. And then finally, get engaged and take action. I already shared the caveat that our impulse to immediately jump to action shouldn't be a way to avoid dwelling with hard feelings. But in the same way that action isn't an excuse, it doesn't excuse us from self-reflection, neither should our painful feelings excuse us from doing the work. We can feel devastated and still commit to rolling up our sleeves. And in fact, diving into the work is itself a powerful antidote to despair. This is the answer I give when people ask me, how do you maintain hope? And what I say is, don't get hung up on cultivating hope. Hope is the natural outcome of doing the work. And that's not because of some naive belief that one person planting trees or going to a climate march is going to solve the problem. Once again, the real power of getting engaged is it helps us build solidarity. And this is something that cognitive psychologists repeatedly emphasize, is the importance of imagining ourselves as part of a team, partly for the reason that I discussed about how purpose counteracts loneliness, but also because working as a team addresses the practical concern that our individual actions are too insignificant to matter. And I always hear students say that any effort seems futile because their personal impact just gets dwarfed by the scale of the crisis. I talked about this again with the students I met this morning, this drop in the bucket argument that's so ubiquitous in climate discourse and very debilitating because it leads people to throw in the towel before they even start. It's a very American, Western, individualistic response, and it's frankly one that the fossil fuel industry loves to perpetuate. I'm sure everybody's heard by now that BP actually invented the carbon footprint calculator because they want us to focus on personal responsibility and individual habits rather than engaging in mass movements to transform the larger system. But if we see ourselves as working collectively rather than individually, we can recognize that all contributions sync up with a larger network of change. This is what Adrienne Marie Brown calls emergent strategy. Am I on the right one? Here we go. A movement that spirals out from all kinds of small local actions and connections to create larger complex systems. So I just want to end by saying that, this is where we can recognize some very good news at the heart of the climate crisis. And that is that the solution to the existential loneliness many of us feel is also the solution to climate change. They both boil down to solidarity and collective action. So again, if you want specific ideas or opportunities for taking collective action, you can go to the resources page of my website or any of 1,000 climate groups who are ready to welcome you into the movement. My website, which is the yellow box at the top, also lists a bunch of further readings, like all the stuff that I mentioned in my slides today. These are some of the books that have been the most influential on my work. And so, I really want to acknowledge the extraordinary work of my colleagues and friends that are featured here. And I would encourage all of you to follow up if you want to learn more. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Atkinson. She has very generously agreed to answer your questions, and I have a mic over here that I'll run over to you. So you can take a few seconds to reflect and see if you have questions. Don't ask her what gives her hope. Ask her something else.
I think I've decided that, and next time somebody asks me that, I'm going to ask it back to them, I mean, really, and I don't have all the answers. I've been researching this for a couple of years, but it's always really helpful to me to hear from the audience, like, what kind of strategies do you use to stay motivated, engaged, and to resist despair in your own life? It's not just around climate change, but around all of the bad news we're facing all the time. I think people come from different backgrounds and traditions that have a lot of wisdom in relation to that question. So I'm always learning from students and audiences about different strategies to not fall into that black hole. That is such an important question, and it's so important that I added a section to my website that actually has the literature on that, because I'm not really an expert in that particular area, and I think it's critical to get that right when you're dealing with younger children. Leslie Davenport just came out with a book called is it up here? This is it right here, All the Feelings Under the Sun. So this is for younger audiences. Carolyn Hickman is another psychologist who's looked at how to talk to younger children around climate change. What I remember is that in general, below the age of, say, 6, you really just do not want to introduce any of these really difficult. It's not to say to misrepresent what's happening, but at a certain developmental age, it's really, really important for young people to develop a sense of wonder around the natural world, and for their associations to be associations of play and connection and beauty and curiosity, and to not sort of rob that from them before they've even had an opportunity to develop those relations. So that's really just not the time to be hammering kids with like difficult climate facts. And again, what are they going to do? We're not like asking, I mean, a lot is being put on younger children, but at that certain age, that's just not developmentally appropriate. And then as they start getting a bit older in those discussions around climate change, what psychologists like Davenport have said is it's very important to be honest. So I think there's a tendency to want to sort of hide and shield this material from kids, but they're going to find out one way or another, and then that erodes trust with the person, the caregiver, the mentor, the older sibling. But to always pair that with some sort of a solution, some sort of an action that they can take so that there's not that sense of helplessness. And so those are some of the strategies that I'm aware of that are really important. But yeah, I would also take every time somebody asks me that question, I'll say, I'll share what I know, but also go look at some of the resources by the experts, because for that particular age group, I mean, I know, older teens and college age students a lot better than younger kids, but it can really backfire. I was bowled over by one statistic that I heard. It was something like 20% of all kids under the age of 10 in Australia think that the world is going to end in their lifetime. And so the way that climate messaging has, in many ways, I think, impaired their ability to engage, and I think we have to be really careful about that. Yeah.
Some of the dread I feel with that is that I can't build a community with people who don't believe in me in the first place. So how do we continue to approach people who aren't going to listen to the science? Like what are your approaches to that kind of conversation?
Yeah, you really nailed it. And I made this mistake, a lot of us make this mistake, where, you're going home for the holidays where, Uncle Bob is a climate denier, and so you you brush up on all the latest facts and statistics so you can just clobber him over the head with it. And that does not work. It actually makes people retreat even further into their kind of entrenched positions. It's a difficult thing really for anybody to do who doesn't kind of identify with their tribe. And what the research shows is that emotions and identity are much more powerful than facts themselves in swaying people. So it's really important actually for those messages to come from trusted sources within their social group. Katherine Hayhoe is a climate scientist who's also an evangelical Christian, and she works in Texas, and she's had extraordinary success in reaching conservative audiences who, it might be important maybe not to use the terms climate change at all, but to connect with people where they are. So, actually asking questions is the best way to start those conversations. What do you care about? Because you'll quickly find out that, there really is concern across all different communities. Maybe because that person is passionate about hunting, fishing, winter sports. They might be worried about the health of their kids, the rising costs of energy. There are lots of conservatives who are avid bird watchers. I mean, I guess one of the things that is somewhat encouraging to me about environmental issues that's maybe not true of, say, something around like gun violence or abortion. Like people on different opposite sides of the political aisle actually want the opposite outcomes. When we're talking about climate change or a clean environment, like pretty much everybody wants and is for oceans and wildlife and clean air. The disagreement is over how do we get there. There's a disagreement around policy. So I think it comes down to starting by asking questions and listening to what it is that people are concerned about, and then connecting the dots, because it's not too hard to connect the dots between really any of these issues that are problematic, that are changing people. If they're farmers, if they're ranchers, if they work outside in any capacity, they're feeling it and experiencing it too. And then kind of letting them connect the dots. And then again, I think, connecting people to the work of writers like Catherine Hayhoe and other evangelicals, or, whoever it is from within their group is a really powerful way to prevent that scenario where they shut down before the conversation is even unfolded. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go over it this way so I can see you.
Yeah.
So I was really persuaded about the points about collective action and about how it's really important for us not to see ourselves in isolation when we're taking action on these issues. So we're coming out of a time of COVID where we really relied heavily on our technology to connect with each other. So I'm wondering to what extent you think technology is playing a role in our movement forward, both either in joining together, or if it's forcing us into deeper isolation because we rely on it so much. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about those issues.
Oh my gosh, does anybody here know the answer to that question? It's such a big one. I to be honest, I really go back and forth on this. I see incredible amounts of engagement and organization and global alliances. I mean, some of those groups that I had listed up there are these incredible spaces where people are having conversations, across different continents that just never would have been possible before this particular moment. And I'm sure you all have had that moment, like during COVID, where, oh my gosh, what if this had happened 20 years ago? We would have just been where we have classes over our telephones or something, right? So it has enabled a sense of connection, and I think we'll probably continue to do so, amongst those who are using it as a tool for good. But of course, we've all had the experience as well, where whether it's creating a sense of hopelessness because our news feed is so dominated by stories of despair. To what extent then does that cause people to completely withdraw, and all you want to do is watch cat videos on your devices? It's a question of balance, and it's really hard for me to answer that. I mean, it's going to take a level of discipline that, frankly, it's hard for me to lecture people about because I haven't always practiced it myself. I'm susceptible to those same tendencies, as well as, and I think we go back and forth in terms of our kind of embodied experience of the natural world. I think that's really where I'm much more concerned. Because we spend so much time on our screens, that the sense of connection, the sense of ourselves as living in animal bodies and having connection with other forms of lives because we're embodied beings, is something that is much easier to forget when you're living in a kind of a virtual day-to-day experience. The one point of hope there, I think, is that most people actually are aware of that. When I ask my students, they're not like rah screens. They're like, yeah, I've got 12 of them and I hate it. I'm totally addicted and I'm going to try to go dark. And so, there's an awareness of the problem, but where we go from here is, I would just say that's it's beyond my sort of philosophical ability to predict. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on this. So we'd probably split right down the middle, but.
Two more questions. What time is it? Yeah, two more questions. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead. But let me say it into the mic for the people who are in the live stream. Could you point that way?
Kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum to the question about confronting people who are not with the facts on climate change or whatever. What would you suggest for like comforting your family members or friends who are experiencing climate anxiety or climate guilt?
Yeah, there's, I mean, I think again, one of the questions that my colleague always asked, Sarah Jaquette Ray, so she wrote the Field Guide to Climate Anxiety here, is, all of us that work in this area are well aware of how bad things are. And so, it's hard to disconnect from that narrative because there's the feeling of responsibility to stay informed. But I think the question that she always asks that I love is she always asks when presented with this difficult material, what else is true, right? Because we can always find those other stories and try to sort of turn towards different media feeds. It's not necessarily to replace the bad news, but to rebalance the bad news with the more hopeful news. So I think that that's one thing that we can do for each other is help each other see that our worldview is largely shaped by the kinds of stories that we're consuming. And then, the 5 steps that I listed are that's sort of like a larger kind of long-term steps, but you might not be able to check all of those off on a random Wednesday night when you're falling into climate despair because you read a really difficult headline. So I think even more simple practices that are really have been proven to work for any type of existential distress, regrounding ourselves through slow and deliberative breathing, getting outside. I think that's one way to remember, oh my gosh, there's all of this left to save. There's still so much beauty in the world. And that kind of recharges it because it also reminds us what it is we're fighting for. I think that those are really powerful, but also I think connecting with a group, because what I have found is people who, and myself included, who have really kind of fallen into climate despair, a lot of it has to do with a sense of isolation. And so simply being able to voice those feelings with others and have them mirrored back to you in a supportive, collective way is incredibly powerful. So maybe, tell your friends, here's a link to a climate conversation cafe, and you can log into one of those anytime. It's kind of like AA for the climate doomers. Yeah.
I do have another question, but I don't feel So I see you have a lot of wonderful, great resources on the screen right here, and I have written some of them down because all the feelings under the sun sounds absolutely incredible. But I think this is generally true for any subject matter, is that there's like this learning curve that people recognize before getting into this kind of stuff. So what are some beginning resources that you would recommend to people who haven't wrestled with this sort of thing at all?
I think, so the book at the very top, Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, the reason I think that's such a powerful book is because Sarah Jaquette Ray, who is a professor of environmental studies and the head of the department at Humboldt State University, she wrote it for her students. She did not write it for an academic audience. So it's not all cluttered with a bunch of footnotes. I mean, it's very much research-based, but she kind of did it like a journalist where she's got everything in the end notes. And the content itself, she actually is speaking directly to students. So if you are feeling X, and it walks readers through the psychology and the research in a very, very accessible way. It's also written, structured in 5 chapters that are really, you don't even have to read it in a linear fashion. So you can go to the part on doomism. You can go to the part on how do you talk to people who have differing views and sort of pick it up and hop in basically midstream to any of those chapters. I think not to self-promote, but one of the reasons that I found my own podcast useful to my students is I made the episodes really short. Like I had a sense of my own students' capacity for, the attention runs out after about 15 minutes, and here I am after an hour standing in front of you all, so I apologize. But I kept those episodes to 15 minutes each. And kind of presenting some of this material and the research, and I put the links to the different materials that I'm referencing in it. So if you want to learn more, you can click on that. But if you just want to veg out while you're driving or walking and put in your earbuds, I kept those real short. And then the other book I am really, really excited about that's just coming out is Britt Ray's book, Generation Dread. She has been working on this project for about 6 years. And if reading the whole book feels a bit daunting, because sometimes that's a tough way to start, I would subscribe to her newsletter. So she breaks everything down into a short 6-minute read, and you get one a week. And it's called the Gen Dread newsletter. If you go to her website, it'll pop up immediately. And she's a really expert. She's actually a science journalist. So she speaks to audiences in the way that you would if you were writing a piece for the New York Times or something. It's very, very accessible, but she is whip smart. She's a Stanford postdoc fellow, and the research is really incredible in there. So those would be my top recommendations. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was amazing, and I think you've left us with so many resources and questions to think about and reflect on. So please join me in thanking her again.
Thank you.